My father raised his glass, smiled at everyone in the room, and said I wasn't his daughter anymore, like it was a joke everyone else was supposed to laugh at. My mother didn't correct him. She just nodded and told me to go back to the kitchen because someone needed to watch the kids. My younger sister sat at the main table in my seat, wearing the dress I helped her pick out, acting like she had always belonged there instead of me. And my husband didn't say a word, just kept his eyes on his plate like I had already disappeared. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just been humiliated. I had been erased, right in front of 50 people who were all too polite to call it what it was. If you've ever felt like the outsider in your own family, like you were giving everything and still somehow not enough, then gently tap like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from along with your local time, only if this story truly resonates with you. Because I want to know I'm not the only one who lived through something like this. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and that night at my parents' anniversary dinner was the night everything I thought I knew about my family finally broke apart. It didn't start there, though. It never does. It started long before the speeches and the polished silverware and the fake smiles, back when I still believed that if I just did more, gave more, stayed longer, I would finally feel like I belonged. I had spent 3 straight weeks planning that anniversary party, booking the venue just outside of town, coordinating, catering down to the last detail, choosing the white and gold theme my mother said she always dreamed of but never had, even measuring table spacing myself to make sure the room looked exactly how she wanted, down to the inch. I was the one who called relatives, confirmed RSVPs, arranged hotel rooms for out-of-town guests, and even stayed up past midnight the night before tying ribbons around party favors that nobody would even remember taking home. Sophie, my younger sister, showed up the day of the event in a silk dress that cost more than my monthly rent, kissed my mom on the cheek, and got told she looked perfect, like she always did, like she didn't just walk into something I had built from scratch. I told myself it didn't matter, that this night wasn't about me, that it was about celebrating 30 years of marriage, 30 years of a family I had spent my whole life trying to hold together. But there were little things, the kind you almost ignore because calling them out would make everything awkward, like when my name wasn't listed anywhere on the program even though I organized the entire event, or when the photographer asked who the daughters were and my mom introduced Sophie first, laughing, and then just sort of gestured toward me without saying my name. I remember standing there holding a tray of champagne glasses, feeling like hired staff in a place I was supposed to call home. And then came the moment that should have warned me, the one I tried to brush off because I didn't want to ruin the night, when my mom pulled me aside just before dinner and said, "Honey, we're a little tight on seating. So why don't you just stay near the back and help keep an eye on the kids, okay?" She said it softly, like she was asking me a favor, but her eyes didn't leave mine long enough for me to say no. I nodded, because that's what I always did. I adjusted, I made space, I became smaller so everyone else could feel comfortable. I spent the first half of the evening refilling drinks, wiping small spills, and keeping toddlers entertained, while laughter echoed from the main table where my family sat under warm lights and clinking glasses. Every now and then, someone would ask me if I worked for the venue, and I would smile and say, something like that, because it was easier than explaining why I wasn't sitting with my own parents. Daniel, my husband, stayed at the table the entire time, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, never once coming over to check on me. And I told myself he didn't notice, that he was just caught up in the moment, that there had to be a reasonable explanation for why I felt so alone in a room full of people who were supposed to love me. But deep down, there was this quiet, uncomfortable feeling growing in my chest, like something was about to happen that I wasn't ready for, like all the small things I had ignored were leading to something I wouldn't be able to pretend away. And I didn't know it yet, but in less than 10 minutes, my father would stand up, raise his glass, and say something that would change everything about how I saw them and how they would see me from that moment on. I stayed near the back of the room, holding an empty tray I did not even remember picking up, watching as my father stood slowly from his chair at the center table, the kind of slow, deliberate movement that made people turn their heads without even realizing it, forks pausing midair, conversations fading into a low murmur, until all that was left was the soft clink of his glass as he tapped it once, twice, and then smiled like he had something important to say, something meaningful, something worth remembering. He looked proud, standing there in his dark suit, shoulders straight, chin slightly lifted, and for a second, Despite everything, I felt that familiar pull in my chest, that small, stubborn hope that maybe he would surprise me. Maybe he would acknowledge the work, the effort, the years I had spent trying to be enough for him. He started by thanking everyone for coming, his voice warm, steady, practiced, the kind of voice that filled a room easily, and people nodded along, smiling, leaning in, because this was the moment they had all been waiting for, the speech, the celebration, the story of 30 years of marriage. He talked about my mother first, of course, calling her his rock, his partner, the reason their family had stayed strong all these years, and she smiled like she had heard it 1,000 times before and still believed every word. Then he mentioned Sophie, laughing about how she had always been the light of the house, how she brought joy wherever she went, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it, her eyes shining in a way that made everyone else smile too. I stood there, just a few steps outside the circle of light, waiting, telling myself he would say my name next, that it would make sense, that this was just the order of things, that I was not being forgotten again. But instead, he paused, took a sip of his drink, and glanced briefly in my direction, not enough for anyone else to notice, just enough for me to feel it, like a warning I could not quite understand yet. Then he said, in that same calm, almost casual tone, "And as for Emily," and for a split second, my heart actually lifted, like it always did when I thought maybe this time would be different. But he did not smile when he said my name, not the way he had smiled for my mother or my sister, and something in my chest tightened before he even finished the sentence. "Emily has always been independent," he continued, choosing his words slowly, carefully, like he was building up to something that mattered, something he had already decided long before this night. A few people chuckled softly, unsure if they were supposed to laugh, and I felt every pair of eyes begin to shift, just slightly, just enough to include me now, to pull me into the center of attention without me taking a single step forward. "She made her own choices," he went on, and there was something in his voice now, something colder, something that did not belong in a celebration speech. "And sometimes those choices take you outside of what a family is supposed to be." The room did not laugh this time. The silence came slowly, like a wave rolling in, quiet but heavy, pressing against everything. I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the tray, the metal cool against my skin, grounding me in a moment that suddenly felt unreal. My mother did not interrupt him. She did not correct him. She did not even look surprised. She just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, watching him like this was exactly how the night was meant to go. And then he said it, clearly, firmly, with the kind of finality that does not leave room for misunderstanding. "Emily is not really part of this family anymore, not in the way that matters." It was not loud, it was not shouted, it was not dramatic, and somehow that made it worse, because it sounded like a simple truth, like something that had already been decided long ago and was only now being said out loud. I could feel people shifting in their seats, the subtle discomfort spreading through the room, glasses being set down a little too carefully, eyes darting between me and him, waiting to see how I would react, waiting for me to either laugh it off or break in a way that would make sense of what they had just heard. I did neither. I just stood there, completely still, as if moving would make it more real than it already was. My chest felt tight, but not in the way I expected, not like I was about to cry, but like something inside me had gone quiet, like a door had closed and locked from the inside. I looked at my mother, searching for anything, a sign, a denial, even a small shake of her head, but she only avoided my eyes, adjusting her napkin like she had somewhere else to be. Sophie leaned slightly toward her, whispering something that made them both smile, as if the moment had already passed for them, as if I had already been moved out of the frame of their lives. And then I looked at Daniel, my husband, the one person who was supposed to stand beside me no matter what, and he did not look up, not even once, his gaze fixed on the table, his silence louder than anything my father had just said. That was when it hit me. Not all at once, but in pieces that fit together too perfectly to ignore. This was not a mistake. This was not a bad joke. This was not a moment that got out of control. This was planned, or at the very least, accepted by everyone who mattered. They had all agreed, in one way or another, that I no longer belonged. I could feel the weight of it settling over me, heavy and undeniable, but instead of breaking me, it did something else, something I did not expect. It made everything suddenly clear, like I had been trying to read a blurred page for years, and someone had finally adjusted the focus. All the small things, the overlooked moments, the quiet dismissals, the times I had been asked to step aside, to do more, to expect less, they were not accidents, they were patterns. And this was the conclusion they had always been building toward. I slowly set the tray down on the nearest table, the soft clink barely noticeable in the silence, and for the first time that night, I stepped forward, not into the spotlight they had created for me, but into something else entirely, something steadier, something that did not need their approval to exist. I did not feel embarrassed anymore. I did not feel small. I felt awake. And as I took another step, I realized there was one thing they did not know, one detail they had completely overlooked, something that had been quietly sitting in the background of this entire night, waiting for the right moment to matter, and I knew, without a single doubt, that what I was about to say next was going to change everything. I did not rush, I did not raise my voice, and I did not look at the floor the way they expected me to. Instead, I walked forward slowly, until I was close enough that no one in that room could pretend I was still invisible, and I could feel every eye on me now, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something heavier, something uncertain, because they were waiting to see if I would break or beg or try to explain myself back into a place I had just been pushed out of. I reached for the same glass my father had used, not to drink, just to hold, just to feel something steady in my hand. And for a second, I let the silence stretch, because silence had more power than anything I could say too quickly. My father watched me with a tight expression, like he was already annoyed that I had stepped out of the role he had assigned me, like I was interrupting something that was supposed to end cleanly. My mother finally looked at me, but not with concern, more like she was calculating how this would reflect on her, how much control she still had over the situation. Sophie leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, almost amused, like she had already decided how this story would go and was just waiting for me to play my part. And Daniel? He finally looked up, but only for a second, his eyes meeting mine just long enough for me to see something I had never fully allowed myself to see before. Not confusion, not shock, but acceptance, like he had already agreed with everything that had just been said. That was when I knew there was nothing left for me to protect. I took a small breath, not deep enough to steady nerves, just enough to mark the moment, and then I spoke, my voice calm, clear, and quieter than anyone expected, which somehow made people lean in closer. "You are right," I said, looking directly at my father, and I saw the slight shift in his posture, the brief flicker of satisfaction, because he thought I was agreeing with him, that I was finally accepting the place he had decided for me. "I am not part of this family," I continued, and a few people nodded subtly, relieved that the tension might dissolve into something simple, something manageable. But I did not stop there, and that was where everything changed. But not for the reasons you think. The room stilled again, that same heavy quiet settling in, but this time it felt different, like something was about to be revealed instead of buried. I set the glass down gently on the table beside me and folded my hands in front of me, not as a gesture of submission, but of control, because for the first time in my life, I was not reacting, I was choosing. I stopped being part of this family the moment I realized I was the only one holding it together, I said, and I let my gaze move across the table, from my mother to Sophie to Daniel, making sure they all felt included in what I was saying. I planned this entire night, I added, not as a complaint, just as a fact. Every reservation, every call, every detail down to the seating chart that somehow did not include me. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, some of them glancing at each other, because now they were starting to see something they had missed before, something that did not quite match the version of the story they had been given. My mother opened her mouth slightly, like she was about to interrupt, but I continued before she could, still calm, still steady, not giving her the space to reshape what was happening. "I have spent years making sure this family looked perfect from the outside," I said, and my voice did not crack, even though I could feel the weight of those years pressing against my chest. "And tonight, you decided to make it clear that I was never actually part of what I was building." My father's expression hardened now, the satisfaction gone, replaced by irritation, by the discomfort of losing control over the narrative he had just tried to set. "Emily, this is not the time," he said, his tone sharper, more authoritative, trying to pull the moment back into something he could manage. But I did not stop, because I finally understood that there would never be a right time for me to speak in this family. There would only be moments I chose to take. "No," I replied quietly. "This is exactly the time." I could hear my own heartbeat now, steady and strong, not racing, not panicked, just present, like it had been waiting for this moment as much as I had. "You said I made my own choices," I continued, looking at him again. "And you are right about that too." I paused just long enough for the words to settle, for the room to lean in again, and then I added, "I chose to stay when it was easier to leave. I chose to give when no one asked how much it was costing me, and I chose to believe that one day it would be enough." I let that hang in the air, because I wanted them to feel it, not just hear it. "But I also made another choice," I said, softer now but somehow even clearer. "And that is the part you do not know about." That was when I saw it, the first real flicker of uncertainty on my father's face, the first moment where he realized he might not be in control of what came next. My mother straightened slightly in her chair, her eyes narrowing just a little, trying to read me, trying to figure out what I was about to say before I said it. Sophie uncrossed her arms, her confidence shifting into something more alert, more cautious. "And Daniel?" He leaned back, just a fraction, like he was creating distance without making it obvious, like he already sensed that whatever I was about to reveal was not going to be something he could ignore. I took one more small breath, not because I needed it, but because I wanted them to wait just a second longer, to sit in that uncertainty, to feel what it was like not to know where they stood. And then I looked directly at my father and said, "So if I am not part of this family, then you will not mind when I take back what I have been quietly holding together this entire time." And that was the moment the room did not just go silent. It shifted, like something invisible had just been pulled loose, like the foundation of everything they thought was stable had started to move, and none of them yet understood how much they were about to lose. For a moment, no one spoke, and that was the first time I had ever seen my father hesitate in a room full of people, his mouth slightly open like he had started to respond, but could not quite find the words fast enough to stay in control. And that hesitation alone told me everything I needed to know, that he had not expected me to say anything back, that he had built this entire moment on the assumption that I would stay quiet like I always had. My mother was the first to try to recover, her voice light but strained at the edges as she let out a small laugh that did not reach her eyes and said, "Emily, you are being dramatic. Let us not ruin the evening." As if this was just a misunderstanding, something that could be smoothed over if I would just step back into the role she preferred. I turned my head slightly toward her, not sharply, not angrily, just enough to acknowledge her, and I shook my head once, slow and certain. "I am not ruining anything," I said, my voice steady. "I am just not pretending anymore." That landed differently. I could see it in the way a few guests shifted in their seats, in the way the room did not relax the way my mother had hoped it would. My father straightened, his expression tightening as he tried to pull authority back into his posture, his voice lowering in that controlled way he used when he wanted to remind everyone who he was in the room. "If you have something to say it clearly," he said, and there was a challenge in it now, a quiet warning wrapped in politeness. I met his gaze without looking away. "I already did," I replied, "but I can be clearer." I reached into my bag then, slow enough that every movement was visible, not rushed, not defensive, and pulled out a thin folder I had brought with me, something I had not planned to use tonight, but had kept close for reasons I had not fully understood until now. The sight of it alone changed something in the air, subtle but undeniable, because it did not belong to a party. It belonged to something else, something more serious. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly, tracking the movement, while my father's gaze dropped briefly to the folder and then back to my face, measuring, calculating. I held it in both hands, not opening it yet, letting the weight of it exist between us for a second longer. "For the past 4 years," I said, turning just enough so my voice carried across the room, "I have been the one managing the financial accounts for this family, the property taxes, the event expenses, the maintenance payments, everything that kept this image of stability intact." A quiet ripple moved through the guests now, not loud, but noticeable, because this was not the kind of detail people expected to hear in a speech like this. "You asked me to help," I continued, looking at my father again, "and I did, because I believed it mattered, because I believed this family mattered. He shifted slightly, his jaw tightening, but he did not interrupt. Not yet. What you did not realize, I went on, is that in doing that, I became the one person who actually knows how all of this works, where everything goes, and what depends on what. I opened the folder then, not dramatically, just enough to slide out a single sheet of paper, holding it carefully between my fingers. I did not wave it, I did not shove it forward, I simply looked at it for a second before looking back up. And over the last year, I added, I started making changes. That was when my mother leaned forward slightly, her voice sharper now, losing the softness she had tried to maintain. What kind of changes? She asked, and there was something in her tone now that had not been there before, something closer to concern than annoyance. I let a small pause sit there before answering, not to be dramatic, but because I wanted the moment to settle properly. The kind that protect me, I said. That silence came back again, heavier this time, because now it was not just emotional, it was practical. It was real in a way that made people uncomfortable in a different way. My father took a small step forward, not enough for most people to notice, but I saw it, the instinct to close distance, to regain control physically, if not verbally. Emily, he said, his voice lower now, more contained. This is not appropriate. I gave a small, almost polite nod. Neither was what you said, I replied. That landed clean. Without anger, without emphasis, just truth placed directly in front of him. I lowered the paper slightly but did not put it away. You said I am not part of this family, I continued, so I took you at your word. I could see Sophie watching me now without that earlier amusement, her posture more rigid, her attention sharper, like she was finally understanding that this was not something she could laugh off later. Daniel had not spoken, but his eyes had changed, no longer avoiding mine, but watching carefully, like he was trying to figure out how this would affect him. And if I am not part of this family, I said, looking between them, then I should not be responsible for holding it together. My mother's hand tightened slightly around the edge of the table, her knuckles paling just enough to show through her skin. What did you do? She asked again, more quietly this time. I folded the paper back into the folder with slow, deliberate movements, not hiding it, just closing it, like I had already said enough for now. I made sure that everything I was responsible for, I said, can be separated. The words were simple, but I could see the way they landed, not all at once, but in pieces, like people were starting to connect dots they had not even known were there. My father's expression shifted again, not fully understanding yet, but no longer certain, and that uncertainty was something I had never seen on him before. I picked up my bag, the same one I had carried all evening, suddenly feeling lighter than it had when I walked in. You do not have to worry, I added, my tone still calm, still even. I am not taking anything that is not mine. I let that sit for a second, then added, I am just no longer carrying what was never supposed to be mine alone. I looked around the room one last time, not searching for approval, not hoping for anyone to stop me, just taking in the faces, the expressions, the shift that had already begun whether they realized it or not. And then I turned slightly toward the exit, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward with a clarity I had never felt before, knowing that what I had just set in motion was not something they could undo with a speech or a smile. And as I took my first step away from the table, I heard my father call my name, not loudly, not angrily, but with something new in his voice, something that sounded almost like doubt, and I did not turn back. I heard my name again as I reached the edge of the room, my father's voice cutting through the quiet in a way it never had before, not commanding, not certain, but edged with something unfamiliar, something that sounded like he was no longer sure how this would end. And for a split second, I slowed down, not because I was going to turn back, but because I wanted to feel that moment fully, to understand what it meant that for the first time in my life, he was the one calling after me, and I was the one choosing whether to respond. I did not turn around immediately. I let the silence stretch just a little longer, the soft hum of the room filling the space between us, and then I glanced over my shoulder, just enough to meet his eyes without stepping back into the circle I had just walked out of. We are not finished here, he said, and the words were familiar, the tone almost automatic, like he was trying to pull us back into a pattern that had always worked for him before. I held his gaze for a second, then shook my head gently. No, I said, we are. That landed differently, not loud, not aggressive, but final in a way that made it clear I was not asking for permission anymore. My mother stood up then, the scrape of her chair against the floor louder than it should have been in the quiet room, her composure slipping just enough to show the tension underneath. "Emily, you cannot just walk out like this," she said, her voice tighter now, the softness gone completely, replaced by something sharper, more urgent. I looked at her fully this time, really looked at her, and for a moment, I saw not just the woman who had raised me, but the person who had spent years deciding where I fit and where I did not. "You asked me to stay in the background," I replied calmly. "So that is what I am doing." There was a flicker of something in her expression, something that might have been realization or frustration or both, but it passed too quickly to hold on to. "That is not what I meant," she said, and there was a slight crack in her voice now, the first sign that this was no longer something she could manage with a simple correction. I gave a small nod, not agreeing, just acknowledging that she had spoken. "I know," I said, "but it is what happened." Behind her, I could see Sophie watching, her confidence gone now, replaced by a tightness in her posture, her lips pressed together like she was trying to decide whether to speak or stay silent. Daniel stood up slowly, his chair shifting back with a soft sound, and for a moment, I thought he might come toward me, might say something, might finally step into the space where he had been absent all night. But he did not move forward. He just stood there, hands at his sides, caught somewhere between staying and leaving, between saying something and saying nothing, and in that hesitation, I understood more clearly than ever that he had already made his choice long before tonight. "Emily, wait," he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, and I felt something in my chest respond to that. Not hope, not anymore, but recognition, like hearing an echo of something that used to matter. I paused, just for a second, just enough to acknowledge that he had spoken, and then I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the person I had built a life with, but someone who had been standing on the sidelines while everything fell apart. "For what?" I asked. Not accusing, not emotional, just honest. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes searching mine like he was trying to find the right answer, but there was nothing there that could fix what had already been done. That silence said more than anything he could have said out loud. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like I was confirming something to myself, and then I turned back toward the exit. The doors were just a few steps away now, tall and framed with soft lighting that made the outside look darker, by contrast quieter, like a different world waiting just beyond the threshold. As I walked, I could feel the weight of the room behind me, the attention, the tension, the shift that had already started to ripple outward from what I had said, but I did not look back again. My hand reached the door handle, cool and solid under my fingers, and for a brief moment, everything felt still, like time had paused right at the edge of something new. I pushed the door open and stepped outside, the night air hitting my skin with a softness that felt almost unreal after the heaviness of the room, and I took a breath, deeper than any breath I had taken all evening, letting it fill my chest completely. The parking lot was quiet, the distant hum of traffic barely audible, and for the first time that night, there was no one watching me, no one waiting for me to react, no one deciding where I belonged. I walked toward my car slowly, each step steady, not rushed, not uncertain, just moving forward, because that was the only direction that made sense anymore. As I reached for my keys, I heard the door behind me open again, the sound carrying into the quiet night, and for a second, I paused. Not turning yet, just listening. Footsteps followed, quick but uneven, and I could tell without looking that it was my mother. "Emily," she called out, her voice different now, less controlled, more urgent, and I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but because I knew this moment would matter, not for them, but for me. I turned slowly, meeting her halfway between the building and my car, the distance between us small enough for conversation but large enough to feel intentional. She looked at me like she was trying to piece together something she did not fully understand, her expression a mix of concern and something else, something closer to fear than I had ever seen on her before. "What did you mean in there?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost careful. I held her gaze, steady and calm. "Exactly what I said," I replied. She shook her head slightly, her brows pulling together. "Emily, you are overreacting. We can fix this. You do not need to make it into something bigger than it is." I let a small breath out, not a sigh, just a release of something I had been holding for a long time. "It is already bigger than you think," I said quietly. She stared at me, searching for something familiar, something she could still control, but I could see it now. She was not sure where that control had gone. "What did you do?" she asked again, softer this time, almost like she was asking a question she was not sure she wanted the answer to. I looked past her for a second, back toward the building where the lights still glowed and the voices still murmured, and then I looked at her again. "I stopped being the one who keeps everything from falling apart," I said, and this time I did not soften it. I did not explain it further. I just let it stand as it was. And in the silence that followed, I could see it begin. The first real moment where she understood that whatever I had been holding together was no longer mine to carry, and that what came next was not something she could undo by asking me to come back inside. She did not follow me any closer after that, but she did not go back inside either, and that told me more than anything she could have said, because my mother never left a room unfinished, never stepped away from something she believed she still controlled, and yet here she was, standing in the quiet parking lot with me, unsure of what came next. "You are making this sound worse than it is," she said after a moment, her voice softer now, almost careful, like she was testing which version of me she was speaking to, the one who would apologize, or the one who would walk away. I leaned lightly against my car, not out of exhaustion, but because I finally felt still, grounded in a way I had never allowed myself to be before. "No," I said, "I am just saying it out loud for the first time." She looked at me like she was trying to recognize something familiar, something she could still shape, but there was a distance there now that had not existed before, something steady and unmovable. "Your father did not mean it like that," she insisted, and there it was again, the rewriting, the softening, the quiet adjustment of reality that had followed me my entire life. I shook my head slowly. "He said exactly what he meant," I replied, and more importantly, everyone else understood it exactly the same way. She opened her mouth, then paused, because she knew I was right. And for a second, the only sound between us was the faint buzz of a streetlight above the lot. "You are still part of this family," she said finally. But even as she said it, there was hesitation in her voice, like the words did not carry the same certainty they once had. I let that sit there for a moment before answering. "That is not something you get to decide on your own," I said quietly. She exhaled, her shoulders dropping just slightly, the first real sign that she was starting to feel the shift that had already happened inside me. "Then what do you want, Emily?" she asked. And this time it was not defensive or dismissive. It was something closer to genuine, even if she did not fully understand what she was asking. I thought about that for a second, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to say it clearly, without the weight of years of trying to make it easier for her to hear. "I want to stop being the person who fixes everything while being treated like I do not belong," I said, and the simplicity of it seemed to land harder than anything else I had said so far. She looked at me, really looked at me, and I could see it now, the realization beginning to take shape, not fully formed, but present enough that she could not ignore it. "You are overreacting to one moment," she said, but it sounded weaker now, like she was holding on to something that was already slipping. I gave a small, almost sad smile. "This was not one moment," I said. "This was just the first time you said it out loud, in front of everyone." That hit her. I could see it in the way her expression shifted, in the way her eyes dropped briefly before coming back up to meet mine. "That is not fair," she said quietly. I nodded once. "I know," I replied, "but it is still true." Another silence settled between us, heavier this time, not because there was nothing to say, but because we were both aware that what came next would not fit into the patterns we had lived in for years. She wrapped her arms around herself slightly, not dramatically, just enough to show that she felt something she could not quite control. "What happens now?" she asked, and there was something in her voice now that I had never heard before. Something uncertain, something that sounded like she was asking a question she did not already have an answer to. I looked at her for a long moment, not with anger, not with resentment, just with clarity. "Now," I said slowly, "everything that I have been managing, everything I have been handling quietly, is no longer my responsibility." She frowned slightly, trying to understand, trying to connect that to something tangible. "What does that mean?" she asked. I glanced back toward the building again, where the lights still glowed and the sound of voices drifted faintly through the closed doors. And then I looked at her again. "It means the accounts I have been overseeing will need to be handled by someone else," I said, The vendor payments, the property scheduling, the coordination you rely on without thinking about it. Her expression tightened just a little more, because now she was starting to see it not just emotionally, but practically. You cannot just walk away from that, she said, her voice picking up a hint of urgency again. I met her gaze evenly. I can, I replied, because I was never supposed to be the only one carrying it. She shook her head, stepping slightly closer. We trusted you with that, she said. I held her eyes, and I honored that trust, I answered, even when it was not returned. That silence again, but now it felt different, like something had shifted beyond words, like we had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time, I saw something like worry settle fully into her expression, not just about the night, but about what came after it. This is going to affect more than you think, she said quietly. I nodded. I know, I replied. That is why I made sure everything is documented and clear. That caught her attention immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly. Documented? She repeated. I gave a small nod. Everything, I said. So there is no confusion about what I was handling and what needs to be transitioned. She stared at me, searching for something, maybe a sign that I was bluffing, that this was temporary, that I would come back tomorrow and fix everything like I always had. But there was nothing there for her to hold on to. Emily, she said, and this time my name sounded different, not controlling, not dismissive, but almost careful, like she was stepping into unfamiliar ground. You are serious. I held her gaze without hesitation. I have never been more serious, I said. The night air felt still around us, the kind of stillness that comes right before something changes in a way that cannot be undone. And as she stood there, trying to process what this meant, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. This was not just about leaving the room. It was about stepping out of a role that had defined me for years, and once I stepped out of it, there was no going back, not to the way things were, not to the version of me they expected to return, and I could see it in her eyes now. She was beginning to understand that too, even if she was not ready to admit it yet. I could see it in her eyes before she even said anything else, that quiet shift from trying to correct me to trying to understand what this would cost her, not emotionally but structurally. The way everything she had relied on without noticing was suddenly uncertain, and that realization sat between us heavier than anything that had been said inside that room. We can talk about this tomorrow, she said after a moment, her voice softer again, reaching for something familiar, something that sounded like resolution without actually changing anything. I shook my head slowly, not rejecting her, just rejecting the pattern. Tomorrow will not change what already happened tonight, I said. And I kept my tone even, not sharp, not cold, just clear. She pressed her lips together, her gaze flicking briefly toward the building and then back to me, like she was aware of the people inside, the image, the story that was already forming without her control. Your father did not expect you to react like this, she added, as if that explained something, as if my response was the problem instead of what caused it. I let out a quiet breath, not frustrated, just steady. That is exactly the problem, I said. No one ever expected me to react at all. That landed in a way that made her shoulders shift slightly, like she felt it but did not know where to place it. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the distance between us felt different now, not just physical, but defined, like an invisible line had been drawn and neither of us could step across it the same way again. You are still my daughter, she said finally. And there was something in her voice now that sounded almost like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. I held her gaze, steady and calm. Then why did it take a room full of strangers for you to say nothing when he said I was not? I asked quietly. She flinched, just slightly, and that small reaction told me more than any answer she could have given. I did not think he meant it like that, she said, but the words felt thinner now, like they were losing their shape even as she spoke them. I nodded once. But I heard it, I replied, and so did everyone else. The silence that followed was heavier than before, not tense, just undeniable, like something had settled into place that could not be moved. She looked at me for a long moment, her expression shifting through something I could not fully name, and then she said something that almost surprised me. You have always been the strong one, she said, and there was no dismissal in it this time, no casual tone, just a quiet acknowledgement that felt both late and incomplete. I tilted my head slightly, considering that, and then I gave a small, almost sad smile. That does not mean I was supposed to carry everything alone, I said. She nodded slowly, like she understood that on some level, even if she had never acted like it before. We did not realize it felt like that for you, she said. I let that sit for a second, not because I believed it fully, but because I wanted to respond honestly. You did not ask, I said, and the simplicity of that seemed to land harder than anything else. She exhaled, her shoulders dropping slightly more, and for the first time she looked unsure, not just about what I was doing, but about what she had done. What are you going to do now? She asked. And this time it was not framed as a challenge or a correction. It was a real question. I looked past her again, toward the building, toward the life I had been part of just minutes ago, and then I looked back at her. I'm going to stop building something that does not include me, I said, and the words felt solid, not dramatic, just true. She nodded slowly, like she was trying to accept that even if she did not like it. And Daniel? She asked carefully, her eyes searching mine for a reaction. I felt something shift inside me at the mention of his name, not sharp, not painful, just a quiet recognition of something that had already changed. Daniel made his choice tonight, I said, my voice calm, and I am making mine. She studied my face, looking for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that might suggest this was temporary, but there was none. You are really leaving, she said, not as a question this time, but as a realization. I nodded once. Yes, I replied. The word felt simple, but it carried everything behind it, every moment, every choice, every line that had been crossed. She looked down briefly, then back up at me, and for a second, it seemed like she might say something else, something that could shift the direction of this moment. But instead, she just stood there, caught between what she wanted to say and what she was willing to admit. I reached for my car door then, my fingers wrapping around the handle, and I paused just long enough to look at her one more time. You do not have to understand it right now, I said gently, but it is already happening. She nodded slowly, almost automatically, like she was still catching up to the reality of it. Will you come back? She asked. And there was something in her voice now that felt smaller, not weak, just uncertain in a way I had never heard before. I thought about that for a second, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it in a way that was honest without being cruel. Not the way you expect, I said. That was enough. I could see it in her eyes, the way the meaning settled in without needing anything more. I opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat, the familiar space grounding me in a way nothing else had that night. For a moment I just sat there, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the quiet settle around me, the kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible has already happened. Through the window, I could still see her standing there, watching, trying to understand something that had already moved beyond her control. I started the engine, the soft hum filling the silence, and as I pulled out of the parking lot, I did not look back again, not because I was angry, not because I was trying to prove something, but because for the first time, moving forward did not feel like leaving something behind. It felt like finally choosing where I belonged. And as the building disappeared in the rearview mirror, I realized that what I had walked away from was not just a room or a moment. It was a version of myself that had spent too long waiting to be seen, and I was not going back to that again. The road stretched out in front of me in long, quiet lines, the kind that usually gave me time to think. But that night, my mind did not feel crowded. It felt clear in a way that almost startled me, like something that had been tangled for years, had finally been pulled loose all at once. I kept both hands on the wheel, steady, eyes forward, the soft glow of streetlights passing over the windshield in slow intervals, and for the first time in a long time, I was not replaying what I should have said, or what I could have done differently. I was simply moving forward without needing to explain myself to anyone. My phone lit up on the passenger seat about 10 minutes into the drive, the screen flashing with my father's name, and I looked at it for a second before letting it ring out, not out of anger, not out of spite, but because I already knew what that conversation would sound like. The same tone, the same control, the same attempt to reshape what had happened into something smaller, something manageable, something that would bring me back into place. When it stopped, it lit up again, this time with my mother's name, and I let that one ring out too, my grip on the wheel steady, my breathing even, because answering would have pulled me back into something I had just stepped out of. A few minutes later, a message notification appeared. Then another, and I did not need to read them to know the pattern. First concern, then confusion, then something closer to pressure, and I let the phone stay where it was, silent again as the screen went dark. I pulled into my apartment complex just after 9:30, the familiar structure rising in front of me, the same place I had come back to countless times after family dinners, holidays, events where I had smiled and adjusted and made myself smaller without even realizing it. And tonight it felt different, not because the building had changed, but because I had. I parked in my usual spot, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle fully around me. No voices, no expectations, no one watching to see how I would respond. I picked up my phone then, finally, and unlocked it, scrolling through the notifications. My father had called twice, my mother 3 times, Sophie once, and Daniel had sent a single message that simply said, "We need to talk." I stared at that one a second longer than the others, not because it pulled at me, but because it felt so familiar, so predictable, like the beginning of a conversation I had already had too many times before, one where I would explain, he would deflect, and somehow I would end up apologizing for something I had not done. I locked the phone again without responding and stepped out of the car, the night air cooler now, carrying a quiet that felt steady instead of heavy. Inside my apartment, everything was exactly the way I had left it. The soft light in the living room, the small stack of papers on the table, the planner I had been using to organize the anniversary event, still open to a page filled with notes and checklists that no longer mattered. I set my bag down and walked slowly through the space, not searching for anything, just noticing, the way the silence filled the rooms without tension, the way nothing here expected me to be anything other than what I was. I sat down on the couch and let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Not sharp, not heavy, just a release of something that had been constant for so long it had become invisible. My phone lit up again, this time with a call from Daniel, and I watched it for a second before picking it up, not because I felt pulled to answer, but because I wanted to hear what he would say now, after everything that had happened. "Emily," he said as soon as I answered, his voice tight, controlled, like he was trying to keep everything in place. "Where are you?" I leaned back slightly, my gaze settling on the far wall, calm and steady. "Home," I said. There was a pause on the other end. Not long, but noticeable. "You left without saying anything," he continued. And there was something in his tone that sounded almost like accusation, as if my leaving had been the unexpected part of the night. I let a small breath out. "I said enough," I replied. Another pause, longer this time, and I could almost hear him trying to decide how to approach this, which version of the conversation he thought would work. "You embarrassed them," he said finally, and that was the moment everything became even clearer than it already was. I closed my eyes for a second, not in frustration, just in recognition. "They embarrassed me first," I said, my voice still even, still calm. "That is not how they see it," he replied quickly, like he had already had this conversation with them, like he had already chosen his side before calling me. I opened my eyes again, looking at the empty room in front of me. "I know," I said, "and that is exactly the problem." He exhaled, a sound that carried more tension than anything he had said so far. "You are making this bigger than it needs to be," he said. And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was so familiar. The same phrase, the same attempt to reduce something that mattered into something easier to dismiss. "No," I said quietly, "I am finally seeing it for what it is." There was silence on the line then, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the distance between us no longer just physical, but something deeper, something that had been there for longer than I had admitted. "So what happens now?" he asked. And there was something in his voice now that sounded less certain, less controlled. I thought about that for a second, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to say it in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. "Now I stop pretending that this works," I said. He did not respond immediately, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was quieter. "You are serious," he said. I nodded, even though he could not see it. "Yes," I replied. The silence that followed was different from the ones before, not tense, not uncertain, just final in a way that neither of us could ignore. And as I sat there, phone in my hand, listening to the quiet on the other end, I realized that what I had walked away from was already starting to unravel behind me, and for the first time, I was not the one trying to hold it together. The silence on the line stretched just a little too long, And then I heard him exhale, not sharply, not dramatically, but in a way that told me he was starting to realize this was not another conversation he could steer back into something comfortable. "So that is it?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now, less certain than it had been before. I leaned my head back against the couch, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, calm and steady. "That is it," I said. There was another pause, and this one felt different, not like he was searching for the right words, but like he was trying to accept something he did not expect to hear. "You are just walking away from everything?" he asked. And there was something in the way he said everything that caught my attention, like he still believed this was something I was giving up, instead of something I was finally releasing. I let out a small breath. "No," I replied. "I am walking away from pretending." That landed heavier than anything else I had said so far, because it left no space for negotiation, no space for misunderstanding. He did not respond immediately, and for a moment, all I could hear was the faint sound of movement on his end, like he was pacing or shifting his weight, trying to settle into a conversation that no longer followed the rules he was used to. "They are upset," he said finally, and I could almost picture him standing somewhere just outside that room, still close enough to feel its influence, still part of it in a way I was no longer willing to be. I closed my eyes briefly, not to avoid it, just to let the words pass through without pulling me back. "I am sure they are," I said. "Emily," he continued, his tone tightening slightly again, "this is your family." I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling for a second before answering. "They made it very clear tonight that I am not," I said, my voice even, not sharp, not defensive, just factual. There was a shift on the other end, a hesitation, like he knew he could not argue with that directly, without acknowledging what had actually happened. "That is not what they meant," he said, but it sounded weaker this time, like even he was not fully convinced. I sat up slowly, resting my elbows on my knees, grounding myself in the moment. "It is exactly what they said," I replied. The silence that followed was not as long as the others, but it carried more weight, like something was settling into place that neither of us could ignore anymore. "So what, you are just going to cut everyone off?" he asked, and there was a trace of frustration now, like he was trying to push me into a reaction that would make this easier for him to understand. I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. "I am not cutting anyone off," I said. "I am just not holding everything together anymore." That distinction seemed to confuse him for a second, and I could hear it in the way he paused before responding. "I do not see the difference," he admitted. I let out a small breath, not impatient, just aware of how deeply ingrained this had been. "That is because you were never the one holding it," I said quietly. That hit something. I could feel it even through the phone. The way his silence changed, the way it was no longer just about what to say next, but about what he had just heard. "That is not fair," he said after a moment, but there was less certainty in it than before. I nodded slightly to myself. "It is honest," I replied. Another pause, and then his voice came back, softer this time, less defensive. "So what are you going to do?" he asked. I looked around my apartment, at the quiet, the stillness, the space that felt entirely my own in a way it never had before. "I am going to focus on my life," I said. "The parts that do not require me to disappear to make other people comfortable." He let out a slow breath, and I could hear something shifting in him, not fully understanding, not agreeing, but recognizing that this was not something he could easily change. "And us?" he asked, and there it was, the question that had been sitting underneath everything else. I held the phone a little tighter, not out of tension, but out of clarity. "There is no us if I am the only one standing in it," I said. The silence that followed was longer than any before, and this time, it felt final in a way that was impossible to ignore. I did not rush to fill it. I did not soften what I had said. I just let it be what it was. "I did not know you felt like that," he said eventually, and his voice sounded different now, quieter, more uncertain. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration, but because I had heard that before, in different words, in different moments, always after something had already gone too far. "That is because you did not ask," I said gently. He did not respond right away, and when he did, his voice was almost careful. "So what happens now?" he asked again. I looked down at my hands, resting loosely in my lap, steady and calm. "Now I move forward," I said. There was a long pause, and then I heard him shift again, like he was stepping away from something or someone. "Are you coming back tonight?" he asked. I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. No, I said. Tomorrow? He pressed, and there was something in that question that felt like he was still hoping this would reset overnight, that everything would go back to normal with enough time. I let out a quiet breath. No, I repeated. That was when the silence changed again, not uncertain, not searching, but heavy, in a way that suggested he was finally starting to understand the weight of what I was saying. Okay, he said after a moment, and the word sounded small, like it carried more than he could put into a sentence. I nodded to myself. Okay, I echoed. We stayed on the line for another second, neither of us speaking, and then the call ended. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just quietly, like something that had already come to its natural conclusion. I set the phone down on the table beside me and leaned back against the couch again, my eyes closing for a moment, as I let the silence settle fully around me. There was no rush of emotion, no overwhelming wave, just a steady sense of clarity that felt stronger than anything else, like I had stepped out of something that had been shaping me for years without my consent. And as I sat there in the quiet, I realized that what had started to unravel tonight was not just their expectations of me, but the version of myself that had been built around meeting them, and for the first time, I was not trying to piece it back together, I was letting it fall away. The next morning did not feel heavy the way I expected it to. There was no dread sitting in my chest, no tightness waiting for me to check my phone or brace for what had happened the night before. Instead, there was a strange kind of stillness, like everything had already shifted, and I was just waking up inside a life that finally matched what I had been feeling for years. Sunlight came through the blinds in soft lines across the living room, and for a few minutes I just sat there with a cup of coffee in my hands, letting the quiet exist without trying to fill it. My phone was on the table where I had left it, and when I finally reached for it, I did not feel urgency. I felt curiosity, like I was looking at something that no longer controlled me. There were messages, more than I expected but not surprising. My father had sent 3, my mother 5, Sophie 2, and Daniel had sent another one sometime after we hung up. I opened my father's messages first, not because they mattered more, but because I wanted to see if anything had changed. The first one was short, asking me to call him back. The second was longer, explaining that things had gotten out of hand and that we needed to talk as a family. And the third one carried a tone I recognized immediately, firm but measured, saying that walking away like I did was not acceptable and that I needed to fix what I had caused. I read them once, then set the phone down without responding, not because I did not understand what he was asking, but because for the first time, I did not feel responsible for answering in a way that made him comfortable. My mother's messages were different, more emotional, asking if I was okay, saying she did not sleep well, that she did not want things to stay like this, that we could figure it out together, and for a moment, I felt something shift in my chest, not enough to pull me back, but enough to remind me how easily I used to step into that role, the one who reassured, the one who fixed, the one who made things easier for everyone else. I let that feeling pass without acting on it. Sophie's messages were brief, almost casual, asking what I thought I was doing and saying that I had embarrassed the family. And there was something about the simplicity of that made everything even clearer, because it showed exactly how she saw it, not as something complicated or layered, just as a disruption to the image she cared about. Then I opened Daniel's message, the one he had sent after our call, and it was longer than the others, more careful, saying that he understood I was upset, that things had gone too far, but that walking away was not the solution, that relationships required work and compromise. And as I read it, I felt a quiet recognition settle in, not of what he was saying, but of what he was not saying. There was no acknowledgement of what had been done to me, no recognition of the moment that had changed everything, just an attempt to bring me back into something that had never been balanced to begin with. I locked the phone again and set it down, not with frustration, not with anger, just with clarity. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot below, at the cars lined up in quiet rows, at people moving through their morning routines, and it struck me how normal everything looked, how the world had not shifted in the dramatic way I once thought it might when something inside me changed this much. I took a slow breath, letting it settle fully, and then I turned back toward the table where my planner still lay open, the pages filled with notes from a life I had been managing so carefully. I walked over, closed it gently, and slid it aside, Not with resentment, but with a sense of completion, like I was closing a chapter that had already reached its end. My phone buzzed again, this time with a call from my father, and I looked at it for a second before answering, not because I felt pulled to respond, but because I wanted to hear what he would say now that time had passed. "Emily," he said as soon as I picked up, his voice controlled, steady, like he had already decided how this conversation would go. "We need to talk." I leaned against the counter, my posture relaxed, my tone calm. "We already did," I replied. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, like he had expected resistance, but not that kind of answer. "Last night was not handled properly," he said, and I could hear the structure in his words, the way he was framing it as something procedural, something that could be corrected. "You created a situation that did not need to happen." I let that sit for a second before responding. "The situation already existed," I said. "I just stopped pretending it did not." Another pause, longer this time, and I could almost hear him recalibrating, adjusting his approach. "You took it too far," he said, and there was a sharper edge to his tone now, not raised, but more direct. I did not match it. I kept my voice even. "No," I replied. I responded to what was said. Silence again, heavier now, because he could not dismiss that without acknowledging it. "You could have handled it privately," he said. And there it was, the expectation, the quiet rule that I should absorb everything, and address it in a way that did not disrupt anyone else. I nodded slightly, even though he could not see it. "You could have said it privately," I answered. That landed. I could feel it in the way the silence shifted again, in the way he did not respond immediately. "This is not how families work," he said after a moment, and there was something in his voice now that sounded less certain, like he was reaching for a definition that no longer held. I looked out the window again, the morning light steady and unchanged. "It is not how I work anymore," I said. That was when the conversation changed, not in volume, not in tone, but in something deeper, like the ground it had been standing on was no longer stable, and for the first time, he did not have a clear way to bring it back, and as I stood there, phone in hand, I realized that the shift I had felt the night before was not temporary. It had carried into this morning, into this conversation, into everything that would come next, and there was no version of me left that would step back into the role they were asking me to return to. He did not respond right away after I said that, and for the first time in my life, I could feel the shift clearly, not just in what was being said, but in what was no longer working the way it used to, because silence had always been something I filled for him, something I softened, something I carried so he would not have to. But now it just stayed there, solid and unmoving between us. "You are making a mistake," he said finally, and his voice was quieter than before, not softer, but less certain, like he was reaching for authority that was no longer automatic. I leaned slightly against the counter, my hand resting lightly beside the phone, calm, steady. "No," I replied, "I am correcting one." That answer did not provoke him the way it might have before. It did not escalate. It just settled, like something that could not be pushed aside. "You think walking away is going to solve this?" he asked, and there was something in the way he said solve that made it clear he still saw this as a temporary disruption, something to manage, not something that had already changed. I shook my head slightly, even though he could not see it. "I am not trying to solve it," I said. "I am choosing not to carry it anymore." Another pause, and this one felt heavier, like it was pressing against something he could not easily dismiss. "Families do not just stop," he said, and there was a faint edge of frustration now, controlled but present. I looked out the window again, watching the quiet movement of the morning outside. "They do when only one person is holding them together," I replied. That landed. I could feel it. Not because he agreed, but because he did not have a quick response ready. "That is not how this works," he said after a moment, but the words sounded thinner now, like they were being repeated more out of habit than certainty. I let a small breath out. "That is how it has been working," I said. "You just never had to see it." Silence again, and this time it stretched longer than before, long enough that I could almost hear him thinking, not reacting, not correcting, just trying to understand something that had always been invisible to him. "What exactly do you expect to happen now?" he asked, and there was something different in his voice this time, not just control, but a trace of uncertainty that had not been there before. I thought about that for a second, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to say it clearly. "I expect things to reflect reality," I said. If I am not part of the family, then I am not responsible for it. That was when I heard it, the smallest shift in his breathing, like something in that sentence had finally connected in a way he could not ignore. That is not what I meant, he said quickly, but it did not carry the same weight it had the night before. I did not argue with him. I did not push. I just answered. It is what you said, I replied. There was a longer silence after that, and for the first time, it did not feel like something waiting to be filled. It felt like something settling into place. You are taking this too literally, he said eventually, and there was a faint attempt to reframe it again, to soften the edges, to pull it back into something less permanent. I shook my head slightly. No, I said, I am taking it seriously. That distinction mattered, and I could hear it in the way he did not respond immediately. You have responsibilities, he said after a moment, and there it was again, the expectation, the quiet assumption that I would continue to hold everything in place because that was what I had always done. I leaned back slightly, my posture still relaxed, my voice still calm. I had responsibilities, I said. I fulfilled them. He exhaled slowly, and I could hear the shift now, not just in the conversation, but in him, the realization that this was not something he could direct back into place with a few sentences. And you are just going to leave everything like that? He asked, and there was something in his voice now that sounded closer to concern than control, even if he did not fully understand why. I nodded to myself. I am leaving everything documented and clear, I said. What happens next is not my responsibility. Another silence, but this one felt different again, not heavy, not tense, just real, like the conversation had finally reached a point where there was nothing left to adjust or reframe. Your mother is worried, he said quietly, and the shift in his tone caught my attention, not because of the words, but because of what was behind them. I softened slightly, not in my position, but in my tone. I understand that, I said, but that does not change what happened. He did not respond right away, and when he did, his voice was lower, less certain. She did not know it would go like that, he said. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. She did not stop it either, I replied. That settled between us, not sharply, not harshly, just as truth. You are asking us to change everything overnight, he said after a moment, and there was something in that that almost sounded like an admission, even if he did not realize it. I shook my head slightly. No, I said, I am just no longer pretending it is already fine. That was when the conversation shifted again, not in what was said, but in what was understood, because for the first time, it was not about convincing me to come back, it was about realizing that I was not coming back the same way. So what now? He asked again, but this time it sounded different, not like he was asking for a plan, but like he was trying to understand a reality he had not considered before. I took a slow breath, letting it settle fully before answering. Now you handle what you have been relying on me to handle, I said, and I build something that does not require me to disappear. There was a long pause after that, and then, quietly, almost carefully, he said, I did not realize it felt like that. I stood there for a second, letting that sentence exist without rushing to respond, because it was something I had wanted to hear for a long time, but now it did not change what had already happened. Now you do, I said gently. And in that moment, I could feel it clearly. The shift was complete, not just in the conversation, not just in how he was speaking, but in how I was standing in it, no longer adjusting, no longer explaining, no longer trying to make it easier for him to understand, just stating what was real and letting it be enough. And for the first time, that felt like more than enough. 3 months later, my life does not look the way it used to, and for the first time, that feels like a quiet kind of relief instead of a loss. My mornings are slower, my space is mine, and the constant weight I used to carry without even realizing, it is no longer there, not because everything is perfect, but because it is finally honest. The calls from my family did not stop overnight, but they changed, less demanding, more uncertain, and over time, quieter, like they were learning, slowly and uncomfortably, what it meant to function without me holding everything together behind the scenes. Daniel moved out within a few weeks, not dramatically, not angrily, just with the same quiet distance that had been there long before I admitted it, and while that might have once broken me, now it just felt like something aligning with the truth I had finally accepted. I still think about that night sometimes, the way the room went silent, the way I stood there and did not shrink, And I realize now that it was never just about what they said, it was about what I finally chose not to carry anymore. I learned that boundaries are not something you announce once, and everything magically changes. They are something you live, something you protect, even when it is uncomfortable, even when it costs you relationships you thought would last forever. And maybe the hardest part was understanding that love, real love, does not ask you to disappear just to be accepted. If you are listening to this, and you have ever felt like you had to earn your place in your own family, like you were the one holding everything together while quietly falling apart, I want you to know that stepping back does not make you selfish. It makes you honest. And sometimes honesty is the only way anything real can begin. You are allowed to choose yourself. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity, in peace, in the quiet understanding that your worth does not come from how much you sacrifice for people who do not see you. Thank you for staying with me through this story, truly, because sharing it means I am no longer carrying it alone, and if any part of it felt familiar to you, I hope it reminded you that you are not alone either. If you feel comfortable, I would really like to know, have you ever had to walk away from something you thought you could not live without just to find yourself again? And if this story spoke to your heart, you can gently like or subscribe, only if it feels right to you. My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this: you do not have to stay where you are not valued just to prove that you belong.